Vision. Following clues left by our ancestors, we unbury the past to reveal a knowledge of unfathomable value, putting us just a little closer to our own true birthrights. From the secret history of a possible bloodline of Jesus Christ, the secret history of America's founders, to the secret history of extraterrestrial interaction on our planet, here to bring light to the night. Your host for Night Vision Radio, Renee Barnett.
Hey everybody, how are you? I hope you had a good week since last we spoke. And my name is Renee Barnett, and I'm your host for Night Vision. I have a great show planned for today, and I would like to introduce my guests right away and then tell you a little bit about the subject of the show. But my guest today is a dear friend and a brilliant researcher and an author. His name is Cort Lindahl, and he's been delving into a lot of secrets about our nation's founding and about our ancestors coming from across the waters and their interaction into our society, our politics, and all that sort of thing, and how they influence us even today. But today we're going to focus on one really interesting and kind of controversial story, I guess you could say, and one that I've heard about. I can't even remember the first time I heard about this story, but I'm talking about the Beale treasure and the Beale ciphers. And I remember really it coming on my horizon, I guess, around 1998. I'd already heard of it, didn't know much about it. And I was part of a television program that was doing segments on different things. And it was, I don't know if anybody remembers it. It was very short-lived. It was called $1 Million Mysteries, and it was on Fox. And one of the stories that we did was on the Beale treasure. And at that time, I thought, that's kind of interesting. And I know there are a lot of people that really get into treasure hunting and get very excited about the possibility of finding some amazing hoard somewhere or something like that. But for me, treasure hunting was not really a big thing for me. It was more about finding out hidden secrets and possibly documents and things of that nature. But just let me start out by saying hello to Cort first. Hey, Cort.
Hey, it's great to be
here. How are you?
Good. I'm doing good. It's nice to be here on KGRA and the new Night Vision radio show.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, we got California covered. I'm down here in the South and you're up there in the North.
Right.
And it just as we were chatting before the show, I'm so glad those fires have finally gotten some moisture on them and gotten you guys some relief up there. That was so scary. And I know, this has been going on for quite a while. I know your sister lost her home in the Paradise Fire last year. So it's just been really terrible. But I'm so glad that's over for you now. And hopefully that won't happen again as the weather gets a little bit more moist. Hopefully it will. But anyhow, talking about the Beale treasure and the Beale ciphers, as I did last week, I kind of go back to the good old Wikipedia to find out, what's the commonly told story? What is known, just in the public purview. And so I'll just read just a little bit of what Wikipedia has to say about the Beale ciphers. The Beale ciphers, or Beale papers, are a set of 3 cipher texts, one of which allegedly states the location of a buried treasure of gold, silver, and jewels, estimated in around 2018 to be of a value of around $43 million US. Comprising 3 cipher texts, the first text describes the location, the second, the content of the treasure, and the third lists the names of the treasure's owners and their next of kin. The story of the 3 cipher texts originates from an 1885 pamphlet detailing treasure being buried by a man named Thomas J. Beale in a secret location in Bedford County, Virginia, in the 1820s. Beale entrusted a box containing the encrypted messages to a local innkeeper named Robert Morris and then disappeared, never to be seen again. According to the story, the innkeeper opened the box 23 years later, and then decades after that, gave the 3 encrypted cipher texts to a friend before he died. The friend spent the next 20 years of his life trying to decode the messages and was able to solve only one of them, which gave details of the treasure that was buried and the general location of the treasure. The unnamed friend then published all 3 ciphertexts into a pamphlet, which was advertised for sale in the 1880s. Since the publication of the pamphlet, a number of attempts have been made, I would say countless attempts have been made to decode the 2 remaining ciphertexts and to locate the treasure, but all efforts so far have resulted in failure. Okay, that's the sort of general story. Of course, there's also the idea that this was all a hoax. There have been some, kind of well-known skeptics and others who have called this story into question, saying things like some of the language that was used was not indicative of the time period, that words that were used, such as I think one of the words was stampeding, was not a word that was used until later on. So that's where we stand so far. Some of them are, some people say they're hoaxes, some people think they're real, some people spend their whole lives trying to figure these things out. But why do you think, Cort, that only one of those has been deciphered so far?
Well, part of the story that I've come up with may indicate what some of the other cipher keys are, and we'll get to that as the story unfolds. But it is interesting that the solved cipher key is the Declaration of Independence, because we see that theme surfacing in another famous mystery in Virginia that we can talk about some other time, known as the Bruton Vault in Williamsburg. And also kind of the imagery of Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, of course, surfaces in the Beale treasure as well through the character of Thomas Jefferson Beale, who is the man who supposedly arranged the whole thing and was part of the party of people that went out west to find the treasure.
Well, I know it's also been called into question that, whether or not Thomas J. Beale was really a person, or was he just a made-up person? Have you found any documentation that would prove or disprove his existence?
Yes, I actually found a Thomas Jefferson Beale.
Wow. You can right time period and everything.
Well, he's from a little later, and that brings us to kind of the different schools of thought about the Beale treasure, because the pamphlet wasn't released until 1885. So Beale treasure researchers and hunters have different opinions about whether the original story is pat and happened as it was told, or if this was just kind of an allegory meant to lead you to the real treasure. So what I found is, what I did was broke down the Beale family in Virginia, which is a very interesting family that had early members. Thomas Beale, who came to Virginia in about 1650, who was actually part of the bodyguard troops of Charles I prior to him losing the English Civil War and being beheaded. So a lot of the Cavaliers, as they were known of, came to Virginia and became prominent citizens along with the earlier settlers there in Virginia. So Thomas Beale attended the Bruton Parish Church, where that mystery occurs too. He was from York County and was the sheriff of York County. But what I did was find one of his descendants named Edward F. Beale, who has a lot of strong associations with all of the places mentioned in the mystery. And his nephew was Thomas Jefferson Beale, and both of these men had married women from the same Edwards family. So they undoubtedly knew each other, even though Edward Beale was about 15 years older than Thomas Jefferson Beale. So Edward F. Beale is a really interesting character. The whole Beale family. He was from Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania, where Thomas Jefferson Beale had been from as well. And for instance, his grandfather was once Sergeant at Arms of the United States Congress. And they lived in Washington, D.C. and helped to develop the city. Another man named Ninian Beale had been the original owner of what would become Georgetown in Washington, D.C., which was also not named for King George, but named for another man named George Beale.
I wonder, when you say that he helped to, develop Washington, D.C., did he have anything to do with with the layout of that city?
Not that we know of, but we know they had a lot to do with developing businesses there and real estate and things like that in the early days of Washington, D.C.
Got it.
Right.
Okay.
But his life, Edward F. Beale, is really interesting because he had a huge impact on the development of the Western United States. And he spent a lot of time in New Mexico. But prior to that, he actually was part of Commodore Stockton's squadron that came to California. And Edward F. Beale actually went to Sutter's Mill and obtained a sample of gold, which was said to include an 8-pound nugget that he bought himself. And then he rode all the way south across Mexico and caught a steamship, came to Mobile, Alabama, and made his way across country to Washington, D.C. to show the United States Congress the sample of gold, which resulted in California becoming a state of the Union. So that's a very important part of his life. And really there you see a small treasure already mentioned in association with the gold that he had got at Sutter's Mill and brought back, because he owned that. It wasn't the United States, as he actually purchased it with his own money. And we know he had a watch fob made out of nuggets and things like that. That was part of what he had brought. But later, he made a total of 6 round trips from California back to Washington, D.C. overland during that era. So that's really impressive in and of itself. But later he was involved in surveying what would become the Beale Wagon Road, which later was Route 66 through New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And even there in Los Angeles, there's a famous engineering feature known as the Beale Cut that you can go see today, where they cut through the mountains for this road. So he actually spent time in the region of New Mexico and Colorado, where the original Beale treasure story states that the treasure was found.
Now, I kind of skimmed over in the opening, in the reading of the Wikipedia article about the treasure that was, purported to be in, at least a couple of years ago, value of $43 million. But I remember in, preparing for this show, reading about the treasure, and it sounded like it was huge and weighed tons. Can you kind of just describe for us what this treasure was supposed to be?
Right. It was this hunting party of kind of these Virginia gentry gentlemen that found the treasure, according to the real story. First went to St. Louis, which was kind of the furthest west settlement at that time. This was only a few years after the Lewis and Clark expedition, for example. So the West was still kind of wide open and populated by natives and was a kind of dangerous place. But as the story goes, they made their way to somewhere about 90 miles north of Santa Fe, which comes out to be in Colorado in the Pikes Peak area. And they supposedly excavated this treasure, which included silver nuggets, which is odd because those are very rare, almost to be non-existent. And that included part of what they found, but they found a lot of gold, free gold and everything like that, all of this weighed a lot. And then they were supposed to bring it back to St. Louis before it got shipped back to Virginia and hidden, as the story goes, somewhere near Bedford, Virginia today. So that's kind of unlikely, and that's one of the things that made me question it, with the silver nuggets being involved and the effort it would have taken with no roads or railroads built at that time to get it all the way back to St. Louis, where they supposedly traded some of the gold for jewelry, which was easier to transport from that point. So from St. Louis, there's no problem. You have the Mississippi River and things like that, and there were railroads to the east of that could have easily gotten them back to Virginia. But it is really amazing as the story unfolds that Edward F. Beale later became the Surveyor General of California during the Civil War and became wealthy from that. And some of our Southern California friends may recognize the Tejon Ranch there near the Grapevine before you start going up to get to Los Angeles, going south on I-5. He actually owned that, which is a massive, huge ranch. He was also once the head of the United States Camel Corps, which was interesting, an experiment the Army did using camels in the desert. And as a result of that, the Beale Mountains in the Mojave National Preserve are named for Edward F. Beale as well. If you ever go there, the Beale Mountains are there. So he became wealthy in real estate and everything. And with his connections in Washington, D.C., he eventually owned Decatur House, which is right across Lafayette Square from the White House. So he lived there, and his family ended up owning that for years. And his daughter, Emily Truxton Beale, next owned that. And what is really interesting is this is another big kind of tip-off that Edward F. Beale may have been involved, because his daughter Emily married into the wealthy McLean family. And they ended up owning the Cripple Creek mine in Colorado that is located exactly where the Beale papers say the treasure was found. And that was one of the richest gold mines ever found in Colorado. And Emily Truxton Beale became so wealthy that she eventually ended up owning the Hope Diamond. So that's kind of the class of wealth we're looking at here. So I think Edward Beale may have been involved in developing the whole treasure legend as kind of a Masonic or allegorical story that is supposed to lead us to American treasures instead of a great golden treasure as promised. And part of what we see is the imagery of the Declaration of Independence as the story unfolds.
But now I know you said, and I guess it's widely known that the Declaration of Independence was the key to the second cipher, which is the only one which has supposedly not that has been translated, has been deciphered. And I'm assuming, obviously, that the same key was tried on the other ciphers and it just didn't work.
Correct.
So how do you think the other two will ever be solved? Or do you think they'll just be lost forever to time?
There are some good candidates. Over the years, people have tried other documents similar to the Declaration of Independence to see if they worked. And that what brings me to my research about Thomas Jefferson. Really, I never really would have gotten involved in looking at these oddities of history, including Rennes-le-Chateau and Shugborough Hall in Europe and other places in America that have similar stories like Oak Island, if it wasn't for Thomas Jefferson. So he created two of his structures, Monticello and Poplar Forest, as prime meridians also, or places from which to map and measure. Both the structures have octagonal forms to them, kind of in this old tradition of the Tower of the Winds of Athens, Castel del Monte of Frederick II, and other places that I've researched that it turned out were used as a place from which to measure, or prime meridians that was used in defining their empire or defining the land they owned by having a baseline from which to measure. But I think later people who had a great appreciation for Thomas Jefferson may have also later modified the legend or created it themselves if Thomas Jefferson wasn't involved himself. And these are people like the family of his personal secretary, William Burwell, Edgar Allan Poe, members of the Lee family that attended the University of Virginia when Jefferson was still alive, may have done all of this to kind of lead us to a real national treasure of possibly a first draft of the Declaration or other important documents that President Jefferson may have been in possession of. And that's why it's important that William A. Burwell was his personal secretary and would have had access to things like that even after Jefferson's death. And there are legends.
I'm sorry. Why do you think that? I mean, certainly, as I mentioned at the top here, documents that are revelatory are, to me, so much more interesting than finding a pile of gold or something like that. Even though that would be wonderful, but to me, if it's something that reveals, something about our past or about the founding of the country, is much more interesting. But why would that have been secreted away? Why would it be not? Is it because it was a draft and there were things in it that did not, come to fruition or were changed later, and so they didn't want anyone to know the machinations of it? What would be the point of hiding that and then having people go in search of it and building up the story about a gold treasure and silver?
Right. Well, that kind of attracts people to begin with.
Right. I understand why they used that.
Right.
But what would be the point of, okay, let's say we decipher those other two texts and we figure it out and we figure out where it is and we go and we find it and open up a box and there's an earlier draft of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, it would be a valuable document, but why would they hide it? Why would that be the thing?
On a treasure quest, just like Rennes-le-Château or Shugborough Hall, some of these other stories, or Oak Island that is similar, that is meant to instill in people the value of the Declaration of Independence in a later time, possibly when the patriotic fervor was not there as much as it had been right after the Revolution, that they're pointing out that this is an American ideal that is a treasure in and of itself. And when I look at it from that perspective, too, I studied what Thomas Jefferson's inspirations for the Declaration of Independence were, and I was led to the declaration of colonial rebel Nathaniel Bacon, who is also central to the Bruton Vault mystery in Williamsburg, in which he declared a kind of rebellion against the landed gentry who were more aligned with the monarchy and everything in early Virginia. So this even foreshadowed the Revolution later. Bacon's rebellion happened in 1676, just 100 years before, and it's known that this was one of his inspirations for the Declaration. Another important inspiration is the Declaration of Arbroath of the Scottish King Robert the Bruce. And there's even a Senate bill, a U.S. Senate bill, that states that the Declaration of Independence was inspired by the Declaration of Arbroath of Robert the Bruce. And in that, he was pleading for help from the Vatican against the English at that time, because Scotland was still Catholic at the time. And they also were declaring their independence from England at that time. So some of the wording and the themes of these two documents are important. But as I looked, I even found a third inspiration from a man named Algernon Sidney, or Algernon. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, actually.
I think it's Algernon, yeah.
Yeah. So he had done writing right there at the time of about Charles I that was more oriented towards the formation of a republic in England, or the Cromwellian form of government that switched back and forth with the Stuart kings in England. And he was actually beheaded because of his views. And he was the grandnephew of Philip Sidney, who I've written a lot about. And lo and behold, when I looked into Thomas Jefferson's mother's family, the Randolph family, We go back to Elizabethan England, and there's a man named Thomas Randolph, who was the brother-in-law of Queen Elizabeth's, quote, spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham. So it's terribly interesting that Sir Francis Walsingham's son-in-law, who married his daughter, was Philip Sidney, who wrote the book Arcadia, that I've also related to the Oak Island story and other lost treasure stories, and places like the Newport Tower are all mentioned in this book that was in 1580. So Jefferson's family was definitely aware of this, because later Randolph family members in the 1800s were named Philip Sidney Randolph and Algernon Sidney Randolph.
Huh. Isn't it? That's too much of a coincidence to ignore.
And
yeah.
First, one of his early forebears, William Randolph II, who lived near Jamestown and Williamsburg, named his house Wilton House. And that's the house of Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, who was Philip Sidney's sister. And that is where he actually wrote the book Arcadia.
Right.
So we see a big appreciation of that. We also have a slightly later Thomas Randolph of the same family, a direct forebearer, who was a contemporary poet and playwright of Shakespeare and Sir Francis Bacon, and he lived during that era as well. So that's terribly interesting, too.
Yeah. Now, is it possible that whatever this is, was hidden at a time when, let's say it is some sort of a document or some sort of information that was, it would have been dangerous for that information to have been made public, because there were so many machinations going on with the different groups. And, a lot of people, I guess, were worried about making their own beliefs and ideas known. So is it possible that the reason for hiding whatever it is may not be relevant any longer? Like we may find something and then we say, oh, I see now why they had to hide this then.
Sure. That kind of speaks to why you were wondering it would be a draft of the Declaration, and that isn't as sensational as 30 pounds of gold.
Well, yeah.
They've drawn into the story using the treasure story, and I'm not even saying there's nothing of material wealth included. That's entirely possible. There could be other items that are important to American history, like the proof sets of the regalia for the Society of the Cincinnati, which included swords, coins, and medals that were cast and designed by Pierre L'Enfant, the same man who designed the street plan of Washington, D.C., and there are some clues that indicate things like that are included. Plus, there's a legend of Thomas Jefferson's personal papers being missing. So this kind of ties us back into another legendary story that a lot of people speculate about, the missing papers of Sir Francis Bacon, whose image also looms largely in Thomas Jefferson's life, as he is one of Jefferson's three most admired people. Sir Francis Bacon was. And two members of the Bacon family actually worked for President Jefferson at Monticello that were descendant of the elder Nathaniel Bacon. There were two Nathaniel Bacons in colonial Virginia.
And Nathaniel Bacon was related to Sir Francis Bacon?
Directly from the same family. So here in Virginia, we had the real Bacon family being involved in the development of Jamestown and Williamsburg, and Thomas Jefferson having this huge appreciation of Sir Francis Bacon and the new Atlantis and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like we got some questions starting to come in. But before we start taking questions, I just want to remind listeners that I am your host, Renee Barnett. I'm talking with Cort Lindahl, author and researcher, and you are listening to Night Vision right here on KGRA. All right, you ready for a question, Cort?
Sure.
This is a biggie. I don't know if you can answer it. I don't think I could. Although I know what I would hope. Ronald is asking, are there any treasures that could change our known history?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are different periods in history where even given Thomas Jefferson's friendships with like French gentry families like the Rochefoucauld family, whose name pops up in the Oak Island studies, that he was personal friends with them during his time in France. And um, even, he was great friends with a man named Louis Alexandre Rochefoucauld, who was the first to print, here it is again, the Declaration of Independence in French. So he was the son of the Duc d'Anville, who came to Nova Scotia on the famous d'Anville expedition and died there. But Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and the Marquis de Lafayette used to attend literary salons with Louis Alexandre Rochefoucauld. And Jefferson was also friends with his son, Francois, who later, after the American Revolution, actually visited Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. So he does have these relations to people in France that may have had access to older relics, things like that, that we do see in more of the popular media, like the National Treasure movies that could have come to America.
Well, this is very reminiscent of, in some ways of the Rennes Chateau mystery, where it was like sort of the draw or the shiny object, I guess, was, this treasure that possibly was stumbled upon by this priest, Bérenger Saunière, in the late 1800s there. But it's also, rumored that there were documents and things that, supposedly, according to witnesses, went against the church. So what were those? And it's like, I think there might have been some other things of value that he might have discovered, but probably the real find would have been those secret documents that were hidden, for necessary reasons. So it seems like, certainly if those papers were found and they ran counter to certain things that we have always been taught, then I would think, there's probably a hell of a treasure in the Vatican secret archives.
Sure. It could be
totally could change history.
People who helped us in the revolution that wouldn't want that to be known.
Right.
Things like that. I mean, we have different political factions in the American Revolution, like Jacobites, who were the supporters of the fallen kings of England, the Stuart family, who kept getting beheaded or had to be exiled in France, that kind of maintained a country with no physical domain because they still believed they had a right to rule and that they were the real kings of England, Ireland, and Scotland. And in most of these mysteries I've looked into, there are what I call Jacobite or Cavalier sensibilities. I mean, we even see the Cavalier followers of Charles I was the inspiration of the name of the sports teams at Jefferson's University of Virginia, who are the Cavaliers. So things like that are involved. There's a background history in Virginia and other places that a lot of people don't know, with these influences of these kind of groups of people that would be exiled in the colonies as well, and had an influence on the development of Virginia, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, more specifically, in Pennsylvania as well. So that's a big factor too. The colonies were kind of a reflection of the political mores of England at any given period until the Revolution. So all of those sensibilities are there as well. And there's lots of treasure legends about lost Jacobite gold. In fact, I relate that to Oak Island. And there's some oddities in the Beale treasure that are interesting as well. For instance, I found a man named Louis de la Tour living in Lynchburg, Virginia, right when the Beale papers were released to the public, or being sold for 50 cents a copy, which was a lot then.
Mm-hmm.
But Louis de la Tour was actually descendant of the first French Acadian governor, Charles de la Tour. And it states this in his genealogy, that he's of direct descent from him. And the de la Tour family are intermarried many times with the Stuart family, the royal family of the Stuarts in France. And even Charles de la Tour in France eventually left the French side and accepted a Scottish baronetcy of Nova Scotia, for example. So it was odd that Louis de la Tour was in town at that time and lived there in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I haven't found any direct connections to him and the Beale treasure, but it is interesting, given President Jefferson's friendship with the Rochefoucauld family and other gentried French families that he became associated with during his trips to France and all the time that he lived there.
And what about the descendants of let's say, Beale, that apparently that are named in one of the ciphers? Has anyone ever come forward and claimed direct lineage from Thomas J. Beale?
I'm certain there must be people out there who have that. I haven't really looked into that, and I tend to look more back.
Right.
Time. And, if this is a family secret or something, there may be people that know the truth about whatever the Beale treasure is. I mean, like many other families from that era during the Civil War, the Virginia family was mostly Confederate, and the ones that had moved to Maryland and Pennsylvania were on the Union side, like Edward F. Beale was the man who I think was behind the entire thing. Now, given that, still after the war, they had a family. They knew each other and loved each other, and they were the same family. Mm-hmm. So this could have been during this era as well. There were lots of family fraternities that had secrets that operated to the benefit of their business or whatever, that could have crafted a story like this with their heritage having to do with developing Washington, D.C. and owning Decatur House, that they had a strong value of American history and maybe wanted to craft a story that helped to preserve that. And again, that's not to say there's no treasure involved, because that's entirely possible.
It seems like there was almost like a secret world going on. It's like one for people in these, related families, these, so-called bloodline families, and then one for just the general, Joe Blows like us out here. Although I think there might be some connections in your family. I think there's some in mine too, but they're so far back that I don't think they matter anymore. But it almost seems like it, and I wonder if it's that way to this day. And you hear so much about, shadow governments and secret societies and all this. It seems like there's, or at least it appears that there's sort of one reality for an elite group and another reality for, the great unwashed like the rest of us.
Right. Well, a lot of aspects of these stories, like the Beale treasure, Rain-le-Chateau, or even Oak Island, are initiatory.
Yes.
That when you look,
makes sense.
You might find a certain path which I've done a few times, where you keep going from clue to clue or person to person, and there are these very real connections that you can find. And a lot of it is Masonic as well. I mean, the hidden vault legends like the Beale treasure are part and parcel of kind of Masonic ideals relating to the legend of Enoch and other stories of the temple treasure and things like that are very popular, as a quest item, or something that a lot of people have been searching for centuries, that they know this will attract people. And as I said, in this case, I think you're just being initiated into the American ideal, because we can't forget also that United States is a young country that doesn't have the breadth of in-depth history like in England or France, for instance. So stories like this may have also contributed to a feeling of national pride, of an American ideal. And part of what I have found is people who wrote literature in early America. Many of them were members of the Society of the Cincinnati, which I mentioned before, that was composed of officers from the Revolution, American, French, Polish, and German, mostly, that could have membership in the Society of the Cincinnati and one of their male descendants. So people like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, James Fenimore Cooper, many of the painters of the Hudson School of Painting were members of the Society of the Cincinnati, and all of their works, like Drums Along the Mohawk, the poetry of Longfellow about America, helped to kind of give America this mystique that the old country didn't have, in a way, and that was part of their goal, to, in a nationalist sort of way, to have some pride in America, that there's a history of our own here, and possibly stories like the Beale Treasure, even Oak Island and other places were meant to do that.
Could be. That's really interesting. But I wonder, the treasure, the purported treasure, that's huge cache of gold, silver, and jewels. Is there any information as to where that might have originated? And double question, has there ever been any hint that any of this treasure might have been brought over from Europe?
Sure, that's entirely possible. But with, the Americans that we had in France at the time, I think that's where people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who incidentally were also involved in intelligence gathering while they were over there, could have become privy to the stories of the temple treasure being hidden near Rennes-le-Château, for example, or other similar stories around the continent. The temple treasure also has a lot of different locations where people have speculated it is. So that's kind of the granddaddy of the kind of Masonic view of what a lost treasure could be. But if we look at the era of the Crusades, for example, we do see many of the Latin kings' families, like the Ibelin family, actually bringing relics back to Europe from the Holy Land at that time, like the Sacro Catino or the serving platter used at the Last Supper and things like that. The Shroud of Turin, the Holy Grail itself is kind of the inspiration for the Beale treasure as well. You're looking for a Holy Grail of American history, I believe, because I don't subscribe to the standard story as told. All the clues I found are pointing us to something of a value to Americans, which is interesting, because then this brings us to the Sir Walter Scott connection that I told you about, where he even wrote about that in terms of a relic, a lost relic that would be appreciated along the banks of the Susquehanna River and Potomac rivers that had come from the introduction to his book, The Monastery. So that is also interesting that he knew that. And, of course, that leads us to Avenel House in Bedford, Virginia, which is near where the Beale treasure is supposed to be hidden. And Avenel House was built by the family of Thomas Jefferson's secretary, William A. Burwell. It's in Bedford. And it's really interesting, because when I started looking into the history of Avenel House, I found that there's a ghost story at Avenel House that's called The White Lady of Avenel. So when I looked that up, I found that was from the very same Sir Walter Scott book, The Monastery, that I just mentioned, where he states that there's things in America that Scottish people would no longer value as much as people in America. So the White Lady of Avenel is a character in Sir Walter Scott's book that's a ghost that keeps confronting these monks that are trying to confiscate a Bible that's written in English. But as part of that book, Sir Walter Scott included what's known as the Epistle Introduction, which takes place just after the Revolution. The rest of the book takes place in the early 16th century to mid-16th century, around the time of Mary, Queen of Scots. And as I researched more, I realized the Burwell family who had built this house were actually related to the Avenel family that the book was about. And so they were aware of this whole story. And what's interesting about the epistle introduction is it suggests that the heart of Robert the Bruce was brought to Virginia at some point after the American Revolution. So, of course, when I first realized this, I'm like, wow. I mean, there wasn't even an Avenel family member whose heart was buried at Melrose Abbey, just like Robert the Bruce's heart was supposedly buried there.
Mm.
So I thought about that, but when you break down the heart of Robert the Bruce as an allegory, where it led again to the Declaration of Arbroath, that is the, quote, heart of Robert the Bruce, that was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence. And this whole part of the story had been crafted by Thomas Jefferson's personal family and his family, the Burwell family, who are they're related to the Bacons. They descend in part from Nathaniel Bacon's sister. So they're Bacons as well. And they own the plantation that is now King's Mill on the James, which is adjacent to Colonial Williamsburg, and the Fairfield plantation in Virginia, and lots of other connections to the Washington family, the Lee family, and the Beale family. So they're related to all of that. So this whole story about Avenel House is also very interesting when we consider that nearby is Thomas Jefferson's octagonal estate, Poplar Forest, that there are records of him creating a prime meridian there, or a place from which to measure, that one of the octagonal facets of Jefferson's Poplar Forest actually, quote, points to Avenel House in Bedford.
Wow.
Or the legend of the Black White Lady is still today, and there's even been paranormal TV shows that have filmed there and things like that, which is of interest to you, given some of your recent activities.
Yeah. I've been chasing a few ghosts lately with the Dark Zone team that I've been working with. But let me ask you this. Do you think that there are people today that, possibly descendants of some of these figures, that do know where this place is exactly?
I think that's possible, but we could also look at it from the perspective where they were the ones that were meant to be initiated as well. We know one of the remaining ciphers that hasn't been solved includes all of the names of the people,
right,
who are supposed to have a share of the treasure. So they may have possibly given more clues, or there might be some secret in their family which gives them a little more insight. Or, as you say, they might actually know, and somebody could have even already found it.
And, perhaps accessed some of it, over time, possibly. But let me ask you this then. Do you feel like you know where it is?
No.
Would you tell me if you did?
I would probably have already gone and looked. Avenel House today in Bedford is owned by the town of Bedford, and it's a place where you can rent to have a wedding or some kind of function like that. It's an old historic antebellum mansion that's very beautiful and well built. The walls are brick and they're 2.5 feet thick. So it's possible that something was once hidden at Avenel House in a secret compartment. It's not unusual for homes from that era to have hiding places. That's kind of a tradition in Europe as well. And something could have been hidden there, like the Society of the Cincinnati Medals, Coins, and Swords that I was talking about, the documents I'm referring to, and things like that. It could be. And this could also actually be something different than the Beale treasure. This is just a separate kind of odd track of research that led me to the book and everything. It was so elaborate that they named their house after the book. They were related to the people in the book, and that there's a ghost legend there. So the Burwells were closely related to Robert E. Lee, and they're the Confederate general. And there's even a story of him making a secret visit to Avenel House after the war.
Mm.
And going back to Washington and Lee College in Lexington, which isn't too far to the north from Bedford across the Blue Ridge. So, yes, it's entirely possible that these families all know about it, or at least know they're supposed to look for it, that it could be a part of their tradition as well. I mean, some people link the whole story to Confederate gold. I haven't seen a direct link to that yet, but that's entirely possible as well. So there's that, or they could have used the same technique later to hide any spoils from the Civil War too.
I mean, I could see if it was just, raw gold and silver, but it sounds like there were some. Now, when they're talking about jewels, are they talking about just gems, or are they talking about jewelry? Do you know?
The way it's worded, to me, it means jewelry that they traded some of the gold for in St. Louis.
Oh, that's right. That's what you said. That's probably what that's all about.
Right. And later it's interesting, too, because in the Civil War, we see the Knights of the Golden Circle, kind of their intelligence service, even using octagonal templates to hide stashes of weapons and money for their agents to access later, because they had been initiated into how to use that technique, like what I described of the octagon of poplar forest and everything. They'd have a secret beginning point. They'd use an octagonal template, which would tell them which way to go, and they would find their little stash of money to help them in their activities. So this was later actually used by the Confederacy in the Civil War, these techniques as well.
Right. Very cool. Oh, my goodness. So will you continue to research this subject? I mean, I would imagine with some of your other research that I know about, it probably crosses over back and forth. You probably wind in and out of it a little bit.
Oh, yes, I'm continuing, and actually I'm working with my friend Justin Kennedy, who actually found a broadside copy of the Declaration of Independence that he believes is connected to the Beale treasure, and he actually found this in a false-bottomed box in Pennsylvania, right near where Thomas Jefferson Beale was actually from.
Mm.
So look for more of that. You should actually have him on your show, because that's an amazing story where he can tell you about an actual just post-revolution copy of the Declaration of Independence that he found when he was a young man.
And where did he find that? I mean, maybe I'll ask him, but that is interesting.
Dump that had a false bottom in it, and it got banged around in the back of the truck, and there was a rolled up copy, broadside copy of the Declaration hidden in the bottom of this box.
That is so wild.
That sent him on a Beale treasure quest that he can tell you all about.
Yeah. I tell you, this thing has really gotten hold of a lot of people. It's really fascinated. I mean, we have several stories or locations that seem to draw people in, and this is certainly one of them.
Right. Ken Bauman, our friend Ken Bauman, is also a Beale treasure fanatic.
Oh, and speaking of Ken Bauman, I'm having Ken's friend, oh my gosh, it just suddenly slipped my head, James Becker, on next week to talk about the Constitution, and I'll see if I can pick their brains a little bit more about maybe the Beale treasure. But yeah, that's going to be next week, people. We're going to stay in the New World, and we're going to be looking at some secrets of the U.S. Constitution. So that should be very, very interesting. Gosh, we're right down to the wire here. I think we've got about 1 minute left, but I want to thank you for once again coming on Night Vision, especially in my new location at KGRA, which I'm very grateful for. And I want to thank Bill, my producer, who always has everything under control, even things he's not supposed to control. No, just kidding. But anyway, and I want to thank KGRA once again for having me.
Absolutely.
And I just hope you'll come back again, Cort, and share some more of your research, and maybe we'll delve into another subject. What would you like to talk about next time?
Well, we could tell you about the Bruton Vault next time because it's actually related to the Beale treasure and may indeed be the same mystery that was extended from there, because that involves the Declaration of Independence as well.
That is so wild. And so are you thinking that the Bruton Vault might contain the Beale treasure?
I think the Bruton Vault is actually the missing remains of colonial rebel Nathaniel Bacon that they secretly buried in the Bruton Parish churchyard, and that later got twisted into a legend of Sir Francis Bacon's papers being hidden there.
Oh, I see.
Yes. So,
why was he secretly buried?
And then I'll tell you why Edward F. Beale's son, Truxton Beale, is actually entombed in the Bruton Parish churchyard.
Oh, wow. Well, I think that's all we've got time for today, but I'll look forward to discussing that with you next time, Cort. And be sure and listen next week, everyone, to Night Vision on KGRA. We're going to be talking to James Becker, and we're going to be talking about the U.S. Constitution. And I'm pretty sure we're going to hear some things that probably none of us have heard before.
All right.
So
Thanks
please.
for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Cort. Take care, everybody. Be safe. Protect each other. Please wear a mask. Thank you.